details of the strikes that we executed last night. And could I get the first graphic up, please? As you've heard from the President of the United States and directly in this room from Secretary Mattis and Chairman Dunford, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, 3 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, conducted a proportional, precision, coordinated strike in response to the Syrian regime's continued use of chemical weapons. This combined military strike was directed against 3 distinct Syrian chemical weapons program targets, and I'm going to show them to you in turn on the monitor behind me, and I think you have access to that information also. The 3 facilities are more appropriately now, were fundamental components of the regime's chemical weapons warfare infrastructure. Let's go to the first slide, please. The Barza Research and Development Center. Next slide. Pardon me. The Him Shinsar Chemical Weapons Storage Facility. And last, and the next slide, please, the Him Shinsar Chemical Weapons Bunker Facility, which is located about 7 kilometers from the previous Him Shinsar site. This strike aimed to deliver a clear and ambiguous message to the Syrian regime that their use of chemical weapons against innocent civilians is inexcusable and to deter any future use of chemical weapons. We selected these targets carefully to minimize the risk to innocent civilians. We're still conducting a more detailed damage assessment, but initial indications are that we accomplished our military objectives without material interference from Syria. I'd use 3 words to describe this operation: precise, overwhelming, and effective. Let's go back to the first Barza slide, please. Against the first target, the Barza Research and Development Center, which is located in the greater Damascus area, we employed 76 missiles. 57 of these were Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, and 19 were Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles, or JASSMs. As you can see for yourself from the graphics, initial assessments are that this target was destroyed. This is going to set the Syrian chemical weapons program back for years. And you also note that we've successfully destroyed 3 buildings in metropolitan Damascus, one of the most heavily defended aerospace areas in the world. Next slide, please. Against the second target, the Him Shinsar Chemical Weapons Storage Facility, which is located in Syria just west of Homs, 22 weapons were employed: 9 U.S. TLAMs, 8 Storm Shadow missiles, 3 naval cruise missiles, and 2 Scalp land attack cruise missiles. So this target was attacked by all coalition forces. Our Tomahawks, the British Storm Shadow, and then the French missiles went against it as well. Against the third target, next slide, the Him Shinsar Chemical Weapons Bunker Facility, we deployed 7 Scalp missiles. Again, the initial assessment is that this bunker facility was successfully hit. I'd now just like to talk a bit about the specific platforms that were part of this strike. And let's go back to the first slide, please. The missiles that I've just described were delivered from British, French, and U.S. air and naval platforms in the Red Sea, the Northern Arabian Gulf, and the Eastern Mediterranean. All weapons hit their targets at very close to the designated time on target of about 4 a.m. in Syria, which of course is 9 o'clock here on the East Coast. I'm going to give you a little more details now about the platforms. First, in the Red Sea, the Ticonderoga class cruiser Monterey fired 30 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, and the Arleigh Burke class destroyer Laboon fired 7 Tomahawks. In the North Arabian Gulf, the Burke class destroyer Higgins fired 23 Tomahawks. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the French frigate Languedoc fired 3 missiles of their naval version of the Scap missile. Also in the Mediterranean, the Virginia-class submarine John Warner fired 6 Tomahawk missiles. In the air, 2 B-1 Lancer bombers fired 19 Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles. In addition, our British allies flew a combination of Tornadoes and Typhoons and launched 8 Storm Shadow missiles. Our French allies flew a combination of Rafales and Mirages and launched 9 Scalp missiles. Taken together, and as you can see from the graphic behind me, these attacks on multiple axes were able to overwhelm the Syrian air defense system. It's also important to note that we flew a variety of defensive counter-air, tanker, and electronic warfare aircraft in support of these operations. None of our aircraft or missiles involved in this operation were successfully engaged by Syrian air defenses, and we have no indication that Russian air defense systems were employed. We are confident that all of our missiles reached their targets. At the end of the strike mission, all our aircraft safely returned to their bases. We assessed that over 40 surface-to-air missiles were employed by the Syrian regime. Most of these launches occurred after the last impact of our strike was over. It is likely that the regime shot many of these missiles on a ballistic trajectory. I mean by that, without guidance. And we assessed that the defensive efforts of Syria were largely ineffective and clearly increased risk to their own people based on this indiscriminate response. When you shoot iron into the air without guidance, it's going to come down somewhere. By contrast, the precise nature of our strike and the care which our Allied team planned and executed significantly reduced the risk of collateral damage to civilians. In summary, in a powerful show of Allied unity, we deployed 105 weapons against 3 targets that will significantly impact the Syrian regime's ability to develop, deploy, and use chemical weapons in the future. It's been said before, but I want to emphasize again that by comparison, this strike was double the size of the last strike in April 2017, and I'd also emphasize that this strike was a multinational effort. The precision strike was executed with France and the UK, demonstrating our unquestionable resolve. I'd like to close by noting that since the strike, we have not seen any military response from actors within Syria, and we remain postured to protect our forces and those of the coalition should anything occur. Dana, back to you.
So with that, we'll take your questions. Bob.
Thank you. General McKenzie, you said that you assessed initially that the attack cumulatively set back the Syrian chemical weapon program for years. Can you elaborate on that? Ms. White said that it was intended to cripple it. Can you be more specific?
Sure. I think
we.
Well, as of right now, we are not aware of any. I'll answer that part first. As of now, we're not aware of any civilian casualties. Now, I would also note, and as I said in my prepared remarks, the Syrians shot 40 large missiles into the air last night. Those missiles came down somewhere. And so we should just recognize that's a part of this. That's a part of this equation too. But we don't right now. We have no reporting of any civilian casualties against any of the targets that we struck, and we'll continue to look at this closely as we go ahead. So very briefly, the first part of your question, particularly the Barza facility, is a core site for them. And as you can see from the graphic, it does not exist anymore. And we believe they've lost a lot of equipment, they've lost a lot of material, and it's going to have a significant effect on them. So I think the words cripple and degrade are good, accurate words.
Tom.
Secretary Mattis said last night he was pretty convinced that chlorine was used. He's still waiting on sarin. He also said he was confident that the Syrian regime mounted these chemical attacks. What evidence do you have of both, of chlorine and of the Syrian attack? And also the OPCW is on the ground now. They're collecting information on that.
We are still assessing, but as the Secretary said last night, he is confident of the evidence that we already had, and which is why he recommended the strikes last night. But we are still assessing and getting details, and we can provide more details once we have them.
Well, can you give us a sense of what evidence you do have?
There's various intel, and I won't speak to that. But when we have more evidence and more details, I will come back to you, Tom. Barbara.
For both of you. First, General McKenzie, could you speak about, in Barza and these other facilities, are you convinced there were chemical agents inside at the time of the strike? How did you mitigate not having a dispersal of a chemical agent cloud? And Dana, yesterday the President talked about the possibility of a sustained response. And the Secretary last night spoke about this being a single strike at this time. Could you help people understand, is there a difference there? What are they both talking about? But for both of you, please.
Sure. I'll start, Barbara. So as we look at each of these targets, we have a variety of sophisticated models, plume analysis, other things to calculate the possible effects of chemical or nerve agent being in there. In relation to the Barza target, yes, we assessed that there were probably some chemical and nerve agents in that target. However, we believe that by the way we attacked it, the attack profile that we used, the way our weaponeers looked at it, we were able to minimize that. And so I just leave it at that. You'll be able to judge over the next few hours the results of that, but we believe that we successfully mitigated against the fact that there are illegal and unauthorized weapons at these sites.
Just to interrupt very briefly, are you doing any post-attack air sampling to see if there was any dispersal?
We look at the target through a variety of means.
And Dana?
And with respect to his comments, I think the operative word is, the words were "at this time." What happens going forward has everything to do with the Assad regime. We sent a very clear message last night, and we hope that he heard it. Joe.
General McKenzie, have you had any contacts with the Russians through the deconfliction lines in the aftermath of these operations, or are you planning to have such contacts in the next few hours?
As you know, the deconfliction channel, which we use between we and the Russians, has operated frequently over the past few months. It continued to operate frequently leading up to this strike and on a routine basis after the strike.
Hans.
General McKenzie, the 3 targets that you struck, were those manufacturing or researching chlorine or sarin?
A little of both, and particularly in the Marsa target, but there's a little of both.
And did any of these facilities have any other non-military application?
No, they're essentially, this is what they do principally. There may be other activities that are carried on there, but this is the core activity associated with these sites.
Phil.
You said that none of the Russian air defenses were not turned on. How do you explain that? Was there an agreement?
I'm sorry, I didn't say the Russian air defenses were not turned on. I said they weren't employed.
Weren't employed, I'm sorry. Was there an agreement with the Russians that they would not employ their air defenses? And then also, you said that the Syrian air defenses did not have any significant impact on the operations. Is that to say that there was no interception of any of these missiles that were fired?
Sure. So we did no coordination, no agreements with the Russians before the strikes. Important to know that. We deconflict, we do nothing more than that. And I want to say that to the best of our ability to determine at this time, no Syrian weapon had any effect on anything that we did.
Tara.
Thank you. Dana, for you, last year when a similar type strike occurred, there was an assessment that it had degraded Syria's ability to generate chemical weapons, yet a couple of months later the Pentagon thought that specific airfield was right back at it. What assurances do you have now that you've significantly degraded Syria's ability to generate chemical weapons? And then for General McKenzie, that slide appears that the B-1s were escorted by U.S. fighters. Could you tell us who escorted the B-1s and what type of surface-air missiles were shot out in the air, the 40? And then getting back to the Russian defenses, if their defenses weren't employed, were Russian radars at all employed? Were they painting any of the U.S. aircraft?
So I'll take the first one. Last year, the focus was on the delivery. This time, the strikes went to the very heart of the enterprise, to the research, to development, to storage. So we are very confident that we have significantly crippled Assad's ability to produce these weapons.
Could I follow up on that?
Let me just answer.
I got you.
So the B-1s employed JASSM, our Joint Standoff Missile. So that was the weapon that they used. B-1s were accompanied by U.S. fighters up to the launch and release point. As a normal way you'd integrate an air package to provide protection to the bombers, just as the French and British aircraft were accompanied by their own fighters as part of an integrated package that provides defense for the shooters. Additionally, we positioned defensive counter-air around the theater, and in fact that's still operational right now as we observe a potential Syrian response.
Were the escorts Raptors?
I don't know the answer to that question, but we'll get back to you. I just don't know that.
David, go ahead.
There were reports that these facilities, or reports today that these facilities had been evacuated in the days prior to yesterday's strike. Do you have any indication, either of you, that that's the case? And wouldn't that, to some degree, degrade your assessment of the damage that's been done to the regime?
Well, sure. The Syrian regime knows that we've been looking at these targets for a long time, so it is possible. It's possible that some people might have left it. We also chose to strike it at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning local time. So we weren't trying to kill a lot of people on the objective, so we were struck at a different time of the day. I believe, however, that there is material and equipment associated with each of these sites that was not movable, and that's the source of that's what really sets them back. And to go back to an earlier question, that's really the difference between striking an airfield and essentially a delivery platform and a research, development, and generation part of the facility. This is far more damaging to Syria.
Michael.
General McKenzie, were the 3 targets that were struck, does this represent the totality of Syria's known CW infrastructure, or were there CW structures that you didn't hit because of collateral damage concerns? Second, is chlorine the new red line? Because the administration monitored the use of chlorine for many months and didn't take any action, and it seems only to have taken action because a nerve agent appears to have been used. And the last weapons question, was the JASSM used, an extended range JASSM, or just the first generation JASSM?
So let me, in terms of the targeting, as we selected targets, obviously the Syrian chemical weapons system is larger than the 3 targets that we addressed tonight. However, these are the targets that presented the best opportunity to minimize collateral damage, to avoid killing innocent civilians, and yet to send a very strong message. We could have gone to other places and done other things, but we, in close coordination with our allies, decided these were the ones that best fit that criteria. So there's an element that is not part of the. There are other elements, and we'll continue to examine those as we go forward. So we did employ the JASSM ER.
And would you say you destroyed most of the infrastructure, 50%, 80%, or?
You can look at the map. You can look particularly at the Barza site and make your own conclusions. I would say they had 3 buildings there and a parking deck, and now they don't. So I think that's probably the one that's easiest to see because it's a building structure. I think we dealt them a severe blow. There's some left, but we dealt them a severe blow.
What about the prospective use of chlorine in the future? The administration didn't act in the event of previous uses of chlorine. Dana, will it act now? Is that a new red line?
What's important to understand is that the Assad regime has a pattern of using chemical weapons against its own people, against the Chemical Weapons Convention, despite the fact that they had agreed to it, and then despite the fact that the Russians were their guarantors. So what happens next has everything to do with what the Assad regime decides to do. And it has everything to do with what the Russian government decides to enable as well. Stephanie?
Thanks, Dana. Why does the administration, just talk a little bit about this, and you guys have touched on this, but why does the administration feel these strikes are enough to deter the Assad regime from using chemical weapons again?
I'll pass it to the general in a second. We were very methodical in making the decision about these sites, and it was a deliberate decision to go to the storage facilities, to go to the research and development facilities. That was the difference. We think by doing this was very successful, and we are confident that we've significantly degraded his ability to ever use chemical weapons again.
One more. And what kind of response should the Assad regime expect from the U.S. if they were to use chemical weapons again?
One, I think it's very important to remember that that this represents 3 permanent members of the UN Security Council who did this. The UK and France are our oldest allies. This is about values. We did this because it's intolerable for any civilized nation to tolerate the use of chemical weapons.
Thank you.
Missy.
Thank you. I just have one follow-up on Michael's question for you, General, and a question for you, Dana. General, can you just, to press you a little bit on the chemical weapons program, can you give us an idea of, should the American public understand that this is a minority of the existing chemical weapons programs? Is this more than half? Is there any way you can give us a better sense of the scale of what these 3 sites represented? Also for you, General, how long did the strike last? How many minutes, hours? And Dana, for you, can you just comment on, to put this a little bit in the context of the broader civil war? I know that the U.S. policy is not to get engaged in the civil war, and that the objective is to get to a negotiated settlement eventually. But we have this significant military response to chemical attacks that in this instance killed an estimated 45 people. At the same time, the Assad regime has continued to use conventional means to attack women and children, civilians repeatedly using barrel bombs and other means. Can you just talk about that? How should people understand the difference in the response to these more isolated chemical attacks and the ongoing conventional attacks by the Assad government on its own people?
It is clear to everyone that the Syrian people have suffered for too long. And it's why we are 100% behind the UN-backed Geneva peace process. And we encourage our allies and partners in the region to also help facilitate that conversation. We have a new UN envoy, and this is an opportunity to really put real steam behind the process. But our mission in Syria remains the same. It is to defeat ISIS. It is not to be involved in the civil war. Christina. Sorry. It's Christina, I'm sorry. There you go.
Missy, so your two-part question. First, we believe that by hitting bars in particular, we've attacked the heart of the Syrian chemical weapons program. Now, I'm not saying that they're not going to be able to reconstitute it. And I'm not saying that it's going to continue. But this has dealt them a very serious blow. So I think that's the core of what I'm saying. Second point is, how long did the attack last? As you know, an operation like this has many, many elements. From a 0-400 time on target, which all our missiles impacted within a minute or two of that time, really several hours before you begin to launch tankers, you begin to launch intelligence aircraft, you begin to do a variety of things. Probably a couple hours before would be the period of maximum intensity for the mission. That's when you're beginning to spin and launch the TLAMs from the ships. That's when your other aircraft are beginning to get to the point where they're going to release their missiles. But the operation actually many hours before in order to just get set up.
Christina.
What would trigger another wave of coalition attacks? Are we talking another chemical weapons attack or retaliation? And do we expect any retaliation either from the regime, the Russians, or the Iranians?
I can't speculate on what could happen, but what I will tell you is that we took action, and what happens next is the decision of Assad.
And also, do we expect any kind of retaliation?
So I can't speak to that, but I can tell you that we're ready for it. We're postured both in the region and globally. We're on the balls of our feet, and we're ready for anything.
Tony.
General, a couple questions. One, was this the least extensive of all the options that were crafted? Can you give us a feel for how many options were put together, and was this the one that would meet at the least amount of damage?
So I would tell you that we can't comment on options we present to the president. That's a choice he makes, so I'm not going to be able to discuss that. I will tell you that of all the options, carefully looked at ways to minimize collateral damage. You balance always minimizing collateral damage against getting maximum effect. These are three targets that seem to hit the sweet spot and do that.
One follow-up. What impact did the very public prelude to this attack have on military planning in terms of enveloping it in maybe a 21st century bodyguard of lies, in terms of deception on ship movements? What impact did it have on possibly launch accesses of the aircraft or ships used? We were all focused on the Donald Cook, and the Donald Cook wasn't used. Can you give some sense of that?
Sure. If I could build on your bodyguard of lies comment, the truth is it had no effect on military planning. It had no effect on military planning.
David.
Yes.
Okay.
David Martin.
I thought I heard you say that the strike put more steam behind the Geneva peace process. How does this help bring peace to Syria?
The UN, we have been very clear about the fact that we fully support the UN-backed Geneva process. Sochi has failed. Our focus remains defeating ISIS. It is not to get involved in the Syrian civil war. We call on all nations, and I think the demonstration of our allies, France and the UK, helping us, demonstrates that we are serious about the fact that chemical weapons use is intolerable, it's inexcusable, but we will remain committed to the 70-nation coalition to defeat ISIS.
But how does preventing the use of chemical weapons affect the outcome of the Syrian civil war?
It affects it by, again, demonstrating to the world that this is a heinous regime. This is a regime that murders its own people daily. We, yesterday, with the help of our allies, addressed the fact that they continue to use chemical weapons against their own people. We continue to hope and urge, and we're confident that the UN process will move forward. But our mission remains to defeat ISIS. There is still work to be done, and we will do it. Right here and right here.
I'm going to ask
3 quick questions. First, were you ready yesterday to engage Russian targets in case Russia responded to that attack? Second, you keep talking about the current Syrian chemical program. Can you give us an idea about the size of this program in comparison to what the regime had before dismantling it? What is in percentage? And third, you're talking about evidence of chemical weapons attack. We haven't seen any evidence, really. That's what you're saying. However, there's an organization on the ground in Syria, the OPCW, and it will conduct an investigation. Why didn't you wait for that investigation to end?
Well, let's remember that OPCW and others have been blocked from entering Ghouta and Douma. That's because of the Assad regime. We need to remember that everything that's happening with respect to the murder of these people, innocent people, is the responsibility of the Assad regime. So we were very confident about the evidence that we had. And it was clear. And the Secretary said yesterday, he was very confident about the intelligence as well as the evidence. And that's why we moved forward.
Then the 2 other questions on Russia and the size of the
Sure.
chemical
We have
program.
an active, effective deconfliction channel with Russia. It's been used months before this attack. It was used through this strike, and it's been used afterwards. And I'm not going to be able to comment on anything more specific on
The
that.
size of the program, the current program that what the Syrian regime has now? Because you said, like, you made lots of assessment, you have a good idea, you have lots of targets. So in comparison to what the Assad regime
I
had
would say
before,
there's still a residual element of the Syrian program that's out there. I believe that we took the heart of it out with the attacks that we accomplished last night. I'm not going to say that they're going to be unable to continue to conduct a chemical attack in the future. I suspect, however, they'll think long and hard about it based on the activities of last night.
We have time for a couple more questions. Idris.
Thanks, Dana. President Trump tweeted about an hour ago, mission accomplished, which of course historically has not borne out when the phrase has been used. And you're saying that if, you've left the option open for future strikes in case chemical weapons are used again. So could you sort of reconcile those 2 statements, mission accomplished and could be used in the future? And in terms of authorities, if there are other strikes, does Secretary have to go to President Trump, or has he been delegated the authority to carry them out as he sees fit?
So to your first point, last night operations were very successful. We met our objectives. We hit the sites, the heart of the chem weapons program. So it was mission accomplished. Give me your second part.
Second part is the authorities question. If there are future strikes, does the same process have to go where you go to the NSC and the PCC? What is the process now?
As the Secretary said last night, the President has the authority under Article 2 to defend U.S. interests and national interests. And so I'm not going to speculate on anything that happens in the future, but this was a fully legitimate operation. Ryan.
General McKenzie, did the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, did he communicate with General Gerasimov in the days or hours leading up to this strike? And then, in addition, do you assess that this has actually fundamentally changed the military balance of the Syrian civil war, or is the Assad regime maintaining its advantage?
So I go back to some of the things I've already said about the deconfliction channel with the Russians. It's a multi-level, robust system of communication that we've employed for some time. I'm not going to be able to give you any more information on a particular conversation that the chairman may or may not have had. What was the second part of your question?
Military balance of the civil war. Do these strikes fundamentally affect that, or is the Assad regime's apparent ascendancy remain?
I think our strikes were targeted to send a message about the employment of chemical weapons, and I think they were successful achieving that military objective.
Well, I want to get someone who hasn't spoken, but way in the back here.
Connie, Channel 4 News. Thank you, Dana. Just following up on Idris's question, this question of mission accomplished. If the mission is to deter President Assad from spreading chemical weapons, isn't it actually impossible at this stage militarily to know whether that mission, as described, was accomplished?
Last night's operations were successful. We met all of our objectives. We hit all of our targets successfully. No aircrafts, allied aircrafts were engaged. It was a successful mission. What happens next depends on what the Assad regime decides to do. Right over here.
Thanks. Patrick Tucker, Defense One. You said earlier that you didn't observe any material effects on forces during the strike. Can you describe any other effects, electromagnetic or cyber effects that were perhaps targeted towards coalition craft? And also, have you observed any activity around residual or remaining sites that you didn't strike that suggests perhaps an after-action plan to hide or use chemical weapons in some other way?
The Syrian response was remarkably ineffective in all domains. That's probably the best answer I can give you. So they had no material impact on the strike. As I noted in my prepared comments, they actually typically began to fire their missiles after the last impact of our weapon. So no appreciable effect that we know at this time.
Any observable activity around other sites?
Can I follow up?
Finish your thought.
Other activity around other sites, perhaps movement of weapons or movement of chemicals or movement of equipment?
I just don't have that information right now. Sorry.
Okay. Tom, yeah.
You said we're very confident about the evidence we have. Now, Russia and Syria denied any chemical weapons were used. I'm just wondering why you wouldn't share your evidence with the world. Adlai Stevenson famously went to the UN in 1962 with evidence of the Russian buildup in Cuba. Why wouldn't you do something similar, especially if there are doubts?
Well, there's no doubt for us.
Well, why don't you share the evidence then?
One, a lot of this has to do with intelligence. And I'm very happy to show evidence if I can. But we were very confident about the decisions we made. I'm going to take one more question from Aaron. You've already spoken. Come on, give someone else a chance. Aaron.
Just a couple of clarification points. Thanks, Dana. General McKenzie, you said, I believe, there's still an air defense package in operation right now in case there's potential for retaliation from either Syrian or Russian assets. How long do you intend to keep that package in the area, specifically keeping an eye on if there's kind of a retaliation to this strike? And then during the strikes last year, a couple of the TLAMs, I believe, failed, just not because of interference, but they just failed. Were there any weapons that didn't make it to their targets this time?
None of our Tomahawks experienced any problems.
What about the air-launched weapons?
I don't believe so, no. Okay. And your last question, we typically keep DCA over deployed forces in eastern Syria. So typically we've got aircraft up over them. So this would, as we open in time from the event going forward, the commander will continually readjust the air defense posture that we've got. Right now it's robust, and we'll keep it robust for a while, then we'll make adjustments just based on our observations of the environment.
Lucas.
General, the Syrian government is saying they shot down over a dozen Tomahawks. Are they lying? And what Syrian military units did you strike? And for the people at home, can you explain this deconfliction? You say you didn't coordinate or give a heads up to the Russians, but you said you deconflicted. And Dana, finally, you say you want to avoid conflict with Syria, yet with all due respect, you just lobbed a couple dozen Tomahawk cruise missiles into the country. Can you explain that?
Our mission stays the same. It's to defeat ISIS. But Assad's actions were beyond the pale. Again, we will 100%, and we are supporting Envoy de Mistura. We will continue to do that because we want a diplomatic, political resolution to the Syrian conflict. But civilized nations can't let what's happened in Syria stand. So with that, I'm going to... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sure. So you asked about deconfliction. Probably the best way to understand it is this. The Russians don't have a veto on anything that we do. And that's probably the best way to describe it. We're not cooperating with them in Syria. We don't want to get into a fight with them. They don't want to get into a fight with us. The best way to do that is to share certain information about what you're doing, carefully metered out by us, and I'm sure the same by them. But we're not cooperating with them, and they have no veto over what we do. At the same time, we owe it to our servicemen and women and those of our coalition partners to do the best we can to simplify the environment in which we're going to fight. So the deconfliction mechanisms allow us to do that. As to the last part of your question, I can't help you with what the Syrians are saying or not saying. What I'm telling you is what actually happened.
And on that point, as Secretary Mattis said last night, the Russian disinformation campaign has already begun. There has been a 2,000% increase in Russian trolls in the last 24 hours. Therefore, we will keep you all abreast of the facts moving forward. Thank you all very much.